The scripture lesson today is taken from the book of Job, chapter 7, verses 6 through 8. And I believe this is an Andrew Stehlik translation. Swifter than a weaver's shuttle, my days have passed. The weft has vanished, leaving no hope. Do remember, my life is just a breath. My eyes unable to see any joy again, invisible to eyes who used to see me. If you look for me, I'll be no more.
So, dear friends, did we not have enough of this doom and gloom last year or even last 2 years? In Job, it all hinges on an bitter Semitic wordplay. The weft has vanished, leaving no hope, which is why I did this translation. I translated one sentence as two sentences because tikwa in Hebrew is the name for a thread or a cord, but it also is a word for hope. And so the end of thread also means or can be translated as the end of hope. The weft has vanished, leaving no hope. How much we can relate to this with every passing day under the lockdown, restrictions to travel, closed businesses and theaters, and limited restaurants and new pandemic waves, always when we had thought it is coming to the end, that it is getting behind us, becoming ever more tired. The threat and hope slipping in between our fingers. And of course, not mentioning those threats or yarns and hopes cut prematurely, way too short. So how much we can relate to this bitter Jobian groan. But, dear friends, that's not why I picked this passage. There is so much more than this bitter Hebrew wordplay. I don't know how could Job miss all that beautiful, meaningful, hopeful stuff present in this metaphor. And I touched upon it with our children. The only reason I can see why he might not notice that is that it is possible because weaving was a female activity in the Middle East in past and more or less until today. And when you have depictions of weavers, those are predominantly women. And men are there to fix the looms and to be overseers. So for instance, on that picture, we had and used for our Friday video clip, there is an overseer towering over two ladies weaving together. So there is a male figure, but maybe that is Job's view. And also this higher power, being in a position of higher power, makes him blind to that more broader and nicer aspects of this image. He became just a superficial observer. Because there is so much more in this image than that gloomy metaphor in more than just one way. It is not half full and half empty. Here, this metaphor, it can be one quarter helpless and 3/4 hopeful. And we need to understand that basics of weaving. The warp are the threads we stretch on a frame. And in those ancient times, they were kept stretched predominantly by weights affixed to the bottom. And therefore, they were almost like strings. And some think that might be the beginning of the harps. They realized that when you play on those strings stretched by weights, they are making sounds, they vibrate. But that's an just small detour. And they are divided to 2 or sometimes more sets. In between them, then the weft is being passed. It is being sent in between them back and forth, and always made tighter to each other going back. It gives impression, of course, because the weft is going back and forth, that the weft is quickly consumed. It seems you need so much more weft for the same amount of warp. But warp is made of many, many strands. Weft is just alone. And so when you calculate it, it is about 50-50. Of course, you can see the weft flying off the shuttle, but it is just an illusion that the weft flies away faster than the warp. But there is another dimension to this. Weaving is not knitting. No thread is able to make a fabric by itself. Knitting and crocheting works with one yarn, or very often, unless you have like doubled, but they are still like 2 together. While weaving works with many threads and mutually intertwined. Weft is not alone, it works only within the larger scheme of things. It must cross its path with warp, sharing its strength, its color, its texture with other threads. And I would challenge you and myself to take a moment and think how many and different threads, how many and different people and situations and experiences and encounters did we make or meet last year. Perhaps those were not encounters we expected or wanted. Nevertheless, they expanded us. They expanded the fabric of our life in some way. With every single pass of the weft, we are adding to our work, to the fabric of our lives. And there is also hope for the time when our weft will inevitably, inescapably come to the end. But here I would challenge that Jobian complain. It is far from being hopeless. The end of weft equals a pack of clothes. You cannot have cloth, roll it up and have it done without spending that weft. It can be hopeless only if we take a very narrow and very individualistic, yes, somehow selfish perspective of life. Loom perceived from a narrow perspective of one weft thread. Just think about it. There are so many things going on there. And of course, yes, weft is a part of it, but just a part. Take few steps back to see a broader picture from the perspective of a loom or from the perspective of a weaver. And imagine that multi-dimensional loom. And each of us in some way, and here we are passing into more imagination than reality, but frankly, each of us is seeing our own life as that thread of weft. So, but imagine all of us like those wefts where we are the warp for others, while those others are weft, and we ourselves are weft, and others are warp. It's unrealistic in a textile factory, but in the larger schemes of things, in a philosophical metaphor, it is very much like life around us. Together, we shape not two, not three, but four or multi-dimensional work in the loom of the universe, meeting and parting and binding and bonding and strengthening and intertwining and departing, threads shaping and forming the fabric of God's workshop of space and time. And far from being depressing, I find it illuminating and awe-inspiring. No, just inspiring. And of course, I cannot miss that in this metaphor, and I've already worked with that way, God is the weaver. That is the most radical part of this image. In his self-pity, Job might not even notice that he was making this radical assumption, this radical theological statement. He most likely missed that. But that is radical and hopeful theology present here. God as female artisan, working with the world, with all of us, independent threads, interlocking, intertwining, working into this miraculous tapestry of dependence, teleology, that means looking at it from the perspective of the result, and altruism. Truly, a feminist theology present in the core patriarchal passage of the Bible. And here I would like us to continue thinking about our lives as coming together and interlocking in that space-time continuum, creating the artwork of the universe.